Great. Thanks so much, Allison. And thank you, Laura and Alexandra, the organizers for tonight. Really happy to be with you and to tell you about this important topic of climate change and health in Connecticut. I'm going to take a minute here and share my screen. All right. Allison, can you see that? Okay. So I look forward to hearing your questions too. Feel free to put them in the Q&A and we can discuss them after the presentation.
Yes, and just to say that Dr. Bozzi and I have spoken in advance, and so we may sort of, you know, if there's a question that I have that is burning, then I might sort of jump in and be, you know, in the middle of the presentation. And she's given me permission to do that.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm the director of programs at the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health. We're based at the School of Public Health. And we do work around research, education, and public health practice to identify and address the health effects of climate change and also the health effects that are caused by those causes of climate change, right? The same fossil fuels and pollution that creates climate change also affects our health. So we address all of that through our programming. I invite you to check out our website. You can see it here. We have a bunch of resources. A couple that I'll mention, you can see on the left, we have a couple online educational programs. So if you find this interesting and you really want to better understand issues of climate change and health, we have an online certificate program, and we also have one through Coursera. And that's also where you can find this report is on our website. I invite you to also join the last of our spring seminar series. It's coming up on April 19th with a faculty member at the School of the Environment. And to stay connected with the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, we're on social media, particularly on Twitter. And we also have a really great newsletter that you can sign up for on our website.
And Dr. Bozzi, what's the specific topic of that? Do we know what the specific topic of that's going to be?
You know, I don't have the title here, but Dr. Bell's an expert, particularly on air pollution and climate change. It may be on the relationship of green space. It may be related to green space. I think that's what I'm remembering. Okay, so as Allison mentioned, we produced a report last fall on climate change and health in Connecticut. And we did this, we were inspired by a global effort called the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change that we're a member of, that tracks how climate change affects health around the world, and then also tracks the governmental response to it. And we thought, this is great at a global level, but we would really like to see one for our own state in Connecticut. And so we set out to produce this report. And what it resulted in is 19 indicators that we use to track across 4 domains: temperature, extreme events, infectious diseases, and air quality. And we tried to go back, we went back as far as possible using our data, and we looked for trends. And we found, just to kind of summarize, that many of the trends are along what we would expect given a warming climate. And then some of them don't show a trend, but we can look at future projections and give a sense of where we're headed for the state. And then based on that data, we make recommendations about the kinds of actions that individuals and our policymakers should be doing now to prepare for those effects and to minimize them by rapidly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And the purpose is to really equip you all, residents, decision makers, advocates, business owners to better prepare for these effects and to be better advocates by having this kind of Connecticut data. I'll tell you for a minute about our data sources for a couple of reasons. One is to say that it was all publicly available. We didn't collect the data ourselves. We found it through government sources at the state or the federal level, in one case from a medical association. And so that also means that it's available to you too. And so if you want to really see this data for yourself and explore it to better understand it, I welcome you to do that. I'll point in particular to one that's on the right side of your screen, Climate at a Glance. And that's where you can get data at the county level for average temperature. It's also precipitation. And you'll see that in one case. It's a great tool for schools. Like if you're a teacher and you want to teach about climate change, it's a really good data set. Okay, so I'm going to focus on these health effects, but to ground us, I'll start with reviewing some of the projected climate change physical impacts in Connecticut. And this is largely from a great report that came out of University of Connecticut and CIRCA, the Connecticut Physical Climate Science Assessment Report. And so one thing to flag with this is that there is strong certainty. We are high confidence in these projected changes through mid-century and until about 2050. That's to say we've put enough greenhouse gases into the air and there's enough of a lag in the system that we know that that we are going to be experiencing changes through about 2050. But then after that point is where there's really two different paths or a variety of paths that we can take. And this is our opportunity to avoid the most catastrophic impacts. And so that's why we need to reduce our emissions today, is to avoid that warming that could accelerate going toward the end of the century. So looking at the next, going toward around 2050, compared to toward the end of last century, toward that base period of 1970 and 1999, we can expect to see 5-degree increase in annual average temperature. And importantly, their annual average temperature means that you also get bigger changes in the extremes. So that means that we could also, that we will also see more extreme temperatures. More annual precipitation, 8.5% increase they expect, but that it won't be uniform across the year. It is expected to be more in the winter and in the spring. And then the summers, we're more likely to see drought. In fact, extreme summer droughts occurring 3 times more often. And with that higher precipitation in the winter and the spring, greater flood risk because of these heavy rainfall events.
Now, Dr. Bozzi?
Yep.
The baseline assumption that's built into this this report is that we have already blown past 3% by, like, is that we've done all that we can to curb carbon emissions, or that we have, is it a business as usual scenario? I'm just wondering what the baseline might be, if you know.
Yeah, so RCP 8.5 is so that's an emission scenario. That's a business as usual scenario, if that's what you're asking. But essentially, the different pathways don't diverge that much from now till 2050. It's after that where you really see the difference in action today. That's not to say if we didn't address the problem when it was raised to us years ago that we wouldn't be in the situation of, that's certainly the case. But now there's not that much of a difference in near-term impacts.
So this is just giving us predictions to 2050.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you. Because I think that's important to remember, is that there's that no matter what we do today, the lag will mean that these predictions are pretty spot on.
That's what the science is telling us, yeah.
Right, and it's my understanding that we already have a 5% increase in precipitation annually in the Northeast from maybe those baseline years. So we've already got the 5%.
Yeah, I'll show you some of that data when I cover the rainfall events.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just mention a couple of other pieces here. There's also a prediction of a 0.5 meter of sea level rise by 2050. And again, this is a moment where that is kind of baked into the system. We've already seen about 1 foot, but what happens after 2050 is the range is quite dramatic, and that's why we need to take strong action now. And finally, Atlantic hurricanes are expected to become more intense with greater amounts of precipitation. Okay, so with that as our framing, I'll add another really important piece of framing, and that's around the distribution of impacts. So we've certainly seen in COVID that the inequities in our society, right? That it has affected some people far more than others, and that's based on historic disparities that have been created through policies and practice in our country. And we know that will also happen under climate change, that those who are most vulnerable will be hit first and worst by climate change. And that is often low-income communities, communities of color. And in this case, it also particularly makes older adults, children, people with chronic illness more vulnerable. And so this is really important to be thinking about both as a justification for action, but also in the way that we design our policies to prioritize those who will be affected the most. Okay, so we'll dig into the report now. As I mentioned before, we've already seen warming here in Connecticut. And in fact, we've seen over 3 degrees of warming since the late 1800s. And that's more than we've seen at the national level. The Northeast is actually warming at a faster rate than the more southern parts of the country. And this is a statistically significant effect. So what does that mean for our health? It's really wide ranging. One is around heat-related illness, heat stress, heat stroke, even death can occur from high temperatures, being exposed to high temperatures. There's also a really kind of dangerous interaction between high heat days and ozone or air quality alert days, because warmer temperatures create more ozone, create more smog that can induce respiratory health effects. Warmer temperatures also mean warmer winters. And we've seen that effect here in Connecticut. Warmer winters make for more suitable habitat for infectious, for vector-borne disease, mosquitoes and ticks, as well as other kinds of pests that can affect our forests and our agriculture. These warmer temperatures, earlier springs, later falls, can create a longer season for ragweed pollen and other kinds of airborne allergens. I'll tell you a little bit more about heat-related illness now. Using data from the Connecticut Department of Public Health, found that on average, there are 422 emergency department visits and 45 hospitalizations per year for heat stress in Connecticut. And as I mentioned before, there are certain populations that are at greater risk than others, including the old and the young, people with pre-existing medical conditions, people with limited social or financial resources, or with social isolation. You can imagine that during a heat wave, if you if you're an elderly person living alone without access to air conditioning, that is an incredibly dangerous situation. Outdoor workers who work in agriculture or construction, firefighters can be exposed to these hot temperatures and often without opportunities to take a break, to get water, get shade, and that can be very dangerous. It's dangerous for athletes who may not be thinking about how it's actually a little bit too hot and too humid to be exercising outside. It often happens during that there's heat-related illness that happens during a running, like a running race in a town that happened a number of times when I was living in Rhode Island. And then pregnant women are more at risk to heat-related illness and to premature birth.
I think you mentioned in your report that there were hospitalizations that were specifically for heat stress. Maybe I'm stepping on your next slide. That there are a lot of other hospitalizations that for other conditions that are exacerbated by.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. So so this number that I report is for heat stress, but it's surely an underestimate, and that's because it's often not. So a doctor has to document the cause of an illness, and it's often not written that it's because of heat, because it was the heat that prompted another condition, kidney disease or heart disease or something, and that's what's noted, and not heat. So we expect that it's much higher. It's also the case that we had looked at data for outdoor workers. We had looked at and you don't see as much of an impact because a lot of times people will, you kind of rest for a while and then you go back to work, but it's not documented. And so it's not showing how it's actually kind of, you're losing productivity as it's getting hotter or that the conditions are getting more dangerous. So it's something that, especially here in Connecticut, where it's kind of a newer issue, and not seen as a serious of an issue, that we don't see the documentation as much.
So I wanted to ask about this global surface urban heat island map that you have in your graphic, the graphic here. And is this can you see where my arrow is on the screen?
No, but maybe you could just tell me.
Well, I mean, I'm just interested to note that it seems like right here in southwestern Connecticut, is orange to red for urban heat island sort of effects. And maybe, I don't know if, again, I'm sorry if I'm stepping on your next slide, but the urban heat island effect is maybe something that is interesting, and it might be worth mentioning if you aren't gonna.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So so the urban heat island effect is the phenomenon where cities are hotter than the area around. And it's for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons is that cities have more human made material, metal, concrete, asphalt, that absorb heat and then release it at night, rather than natural surfaces that are often reflecting it. There's also less evaporative cooling because there's less green space, or trees that are releasing, that are through evapotranspiration, cooling the air around them, or blue space, rivers and lakes. So there's also more engines that are operating that are hot, right? Cars and things like that. So for all of those reasons, urban areas are hotter, and they're hottest in usually in lower income neighborhoods where there is less green space. And so you can see that in this map, that especially in the New York metro area, in the Greenwich area, it's hotter than in the rural areas that surround it. And it also, and then you can see that it kind of tracks along the 95 corridor and the 91 corridor through Connecticut, through our kind of urbanized areas.
Right.
And so this is, and just to say that this is important too, because, you know, those temperature projections that I mentioned, those are for the average for the whole state. It's not for these areas that are hotter. So, you know, and you can often see something like a 10-degree difference between across a city, depending on what you're surrounded by.
Yes, I've definitely experienced that between downtown Greenwich and the backcountry. There seems
Yep.
quite a difference.
Yep.
So, and you're right, it is right along I-95 and many parts of our community, just to bring it really local, live right up against 95. So.
Which we'll get to in terms of air quality too.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I wanna give you a couple recommendations of what to do to address this. And, but I'll also point to an issue brief that we released last month, where we really did a deep dive into what kinds of policy recommendations we make for the state to address extreme heat. So one of them is around our homes, that we want to make homes cooler, but when doing that, to make sure that they're more energy efficient and powered by renewable energy. So many of us already have air conditioning. And if we do, then we want to make sure that our homes have, that we've had energy audits and we've insulated our homes appropriately, that maybe we're using heat pumps or ways to make it most energy efficient. And ideally to be powered by renewable energy to reduce the impact of it. But there are some residents in Connecticut who can't afford air conditioning, and that can be really dangerous for their health. So one thing that we advocate for is to expand the low-income energy assistance program to include cooling assistance. Another policy is to support urban tree planting to address that urban heat island effect, and importantly, to maintain the trees. Because as you can imagine, you plant a tree and it's pretty little, it's those large shade trees that can be really beneficial. And you know, there are some creative policies like shade tree ordinances to help protect and maintain trees. We recommend protecting against heat-related illness at work sites, schools, and sports teams. I'll point to an interesting bit in terms of sports teams, which is that there's legislation that's going through the Connecticut General Assembly now that would require education for coaches and I think parents and student athletes around how to recognize heat-related illness and to prevent it. So that's one important piece. But you want to think about what are some, in addition to education, are there policies like having a certain temperature where then you limit practice or even end practice because it's too hot and humid and it's dangerous, and setting those out would be an important step forward. And then for municipalities like Greenwich, do you have a local heat response plan? Do you have a plan to make sure that information gets out to people, telling them that there's a heat wave coming, and that's coordinating across government and nonprofit partners to make sure that people who are most at risk are taken care of. So that's something that is, you know, part of emergency response plans, but can be designed specifically for heat. And then for personal action, you can check on your elderly neighbors, and you can cool your neighborhood with tree plantings and even cool roofs. You can paint your roof white, especially if you have a flat one. All right.
That's a great idea. And I wanted to mention that you I think in your report you had said that like maybe this is part of the legislation that's going through the state legislature, but you know that schools should establish standards for building temperature, that, you know, so that, you know, if a building isn't meeting the standard, it's got to be closed because it's too hot for, you know, human occupancy.
Yeah, and even below when it's dangerous for human health, it reduces academic performance. And there have been studies that show that. And you can imagine it. I mean, I get really sluggish and it's hard for me to pay attention and have energy when I'm really hot. And you can imagine that for kids that are in really hot schools. And that happens more in places like Connecticut and northern states where we have old school buildings that weren't designed with these modern HVAC systems. We don't really have the policies in place because we've been able to just kind of tough it out in the first couple of days of the school year and the last couple of days of the school year. And that's not the case as much anymore. And so I think also the longer term solution is to be building schools that are using principles like passive cooling and that are really kind of working with the natural environment to make the school buildings naturally cooler and minimizing the energy impact.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to extreme events. And this is one that Allison and I have talked about. We tracked the federal disaster declarations, like from FEMA, for weather events that were issued in Connecticut, and found that there were 9 over the last decade, compared to 13 over the previous 56 years. And when you look at the list, I'm sure that you see names that you remember maybe viscerally, like Tropical Storm Irene, Hurricane Sandy. Maybe I didn't write it, but in there is the Halloween nor'easter. So a couple of these storms that were really powerful and scary for our region. And you can see also that they've affected every county. It's not just coastal, that they've also affected inland counties as well. And you know, when we think about storms, we're often thinking about infrastructure damage, which is very serious, and also about kind of immediate impacts. But when we think about it from a health perspective, it's important to also be thinking about longer term impacts. So what could a large storm mean for our health? Certainly there are these direct dangers like from drowning, but really important here is the disruption of critical infrastructure. So if the power goes out and you are on a medical device that requires electricity, that can be life-threatening. If there is if roads are closed and emergency care can't get to you, that can be life-threatening. There's also issues like losing refrigeration, losing telecommunications, internet, these other kinds of pieces that can be really important for addressing health, and also can have longer-term economic and social consequences. It's also really important to mention here a longer-term impact that can be related to mental health from these kinds of extreme events. There have been studies showing a link between hurricanes, other kinds of extreme events, also issues like droughts that can severely affect people's mental health. Some people can rebound quickly, and others it has a longstanding impact. And often that kind of impact is related to your ability to adapt, to respond quickly. And that again can be related to your resources or your social connectedness, these other kinds of resources that you're relying on to respond after an event.
Absolutely. I wanted to just really highlight that stat on the bottom, you know, in 9 years, 9 federal disaster declarations compared to the previous 56 years had 13 in the entire 56-year period. It's just such a staggering difference. And you know, we all have that thing that makes the light bulb go off for us about climate change being real. And for me, it was a 2006 report I read about. For some reason, this economic report really sort of struck me because it said that, you know, you wouldn't be able to grow raspberries in Pennsylvania anymore, and you'd probably be growing peaches instead. And by 2020, it was, I mean, this was a prediction. And in fact, I think that's happening. There's definitely peaches being grown in Connecticut and New Jersey and Pennsylvania And in 2017, Georgia couldn't even grow any peaches because it was too hot. So for me, that was my like sort of the little light bulb, the little catch moment where I thought, this is what's making me understand it in a very local way. But this statistic that you note down here, I think is so powerful. It's, 9 in 9 years versus 13 in 56 years. So thank you for pointing it out. And many of us remember those storms.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes in presentations, I show photos because because you remember it and yet you kind of forget quite what you went through. The photos can be really powerful reminders. The last point I want to make here is again, this issue of inequality, that the same storm can impact two communities very differently, depending on the how well the status of their infrastructure or their connectedness to resources before the storm. And so it's, I guess, two different storms. So you can think about the way that a hurricane affected Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria, and then say that the next year affected Houston with a new hurricane, vastly different circumstances. Okay. One of our indicators uses great data from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, where they looked at all of the Superfund sites in the U.S. So these are sites that have been identified by the U.S. government as toxic sites, from old industrial sites, brownfields, landfills, and then they looked at how climate change could affect them. And they found that of 16 sites in Connecticut, 7 were vulnerable to climate change impacts. You can see them on the map here. They were mostly affected by flooding. You can see that most of them are actually inland. So they're in the flood zone. But then one of them, I think that one in Milford, is also affected, is threatened by hurricane storm surge and sea level rise. And what's dangerous about this for health is that these toxic contaminants that are in the ground in these sites could be released by the impact of floodwaters or hurricane storm surge, and then be released into the air or into the soil surrounding that site, and that could be very dangerous to us. Another indicator that we looked at is high tide flooding. So high tide flooding is what it sounds like. It's that when the tide is high, an area that is not normally in water becomes flooded, right? And then as the tide recedes, then the flooding recedes. So it's a temporary flooding that aligns with the high tide, but that area is increasing as sea level rise increases. The area that is inundated in a high tide is growing. And in fact, there's a quote here that today's flood will become tomorrow's high tide. So those areas that maybe flood during a storm could be flooded much more permanently. And there are 2 flood gauges in Connecticut. So we looked at both of them, and sure enough, both of them have a statistically significant increase in the number of days of high tide flooding since they were tracking. This one is the New London tidal gauge, and it's the data set begins in 1938. There's also one for Bridgeport that begins later, but also shows the same increase. And this is the case where we can see that there's quite a difference in our features looking out toward 2100, depending on whether we take action on climate change collectively. So you can see that, if we look at the Bridgeport one, since that's close to Greenwich, under a lower sea level rise scenario, so that's under stronger action on greenhouse gas emissions reductions, then about half of the days are, there are high tide flood days. But if you go to a higher level of sea level rise, it's basically every day it's flooded, which essentially then means it's the area is underwater. So what does this mean for our health? High tide flooding can transmit pathogens like Vibrio bacteria if you are walking through the waters. I'll talk about Vibrio a little bit later. It can also contaminate coastal drinking water sources if they're close to the coast. It can contaminate agricultural fields or other kinds of landscapes. And then I think, not from a health perspective, but from a sort of community perspective and a homeowner perspective, of course, it's very concerning to see this kind of flooding. And it starts to raise those questions of what do we do in those areas? If there's a roadway that's continually flooding, how do we adapt to that? How much do we invest in this? What's the likelihood of that being a smart investment, and raises some really hard questions that communities are already starting to grapple with around areas to retreat or areas to adapt. Okay, so what to do? This is kind of a smattering of options here. Again, on housing, housing is a really key determinant of health. It has such important implications for a family's health and well-being and security. And so when we make houses more affordable, secure, healthy, and climate resilient, that is preparing us for climate change, but is also providing so many other benefits, social benefits. A very practical action, if Greenwich hasn't already done this, maybe they have, is to join the FEMA Community Rating System program, which in doing so reduces flood insurance premiums for residents. As I mentioned, certain towns need to begin discussions on planned retreat or how to address these issues that are under chronic flooding. And then thinking about those who might be particularly at risk during these extreme events, making sure that there's proper emergency planning and backup power at congregate settings and senior living facilities, so that if power is lost, that's not life-threatening. In terms of personal action, know your risk, make a plan, make sure that you know how you would evacuate during hurricane or other kind of extreme weather event. And then I'm sure this was talked about a lot in your water session, but drought, which is one of our indicators, I didn't cover it, is expected to become much more prevalent in Connecticut in the summertime. And there's a real importance in adopting water conservation measures, both at the individual level, and then also thinking about that as we are planning out new developments to be incorporating strong best practices. All right, moving on to infectious diseases. Mosquito abundance. I'm sorry I have to say, I think that photo is just like incredibly painful to look at. So for this indicator, we conducted a detailed assessment of mosquito abundance using data from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. And we found that during this period of 2001 to 2019, of 28 mosquito species that are found in Connecticut to carry viruses that cause human disease, that 10 show trends of increasing abundance and only 3 show trends of decreasing abundance. The take-home point to that is that mosquito abundance is a key factor that influences the capacity of a mosquito to transmit a virus and the rate at which infections spread. So as we're seeing this increasing abundance of mosquitoes that are carrying diseases that can affect humans, that this is a concern for public health in Connecticut. And these mosquitoes that that we tracked, they have been found to carry one or more of the viruses that are listed here. And you may remember Eastern equine encephalitis, or triple E, that was a real concern a few years ago. West Nile virus is another one that is a continual concern here in Connecticut, and then a number of other viruses.
And is this because it's getting warmer? So these are tropical disease-carrying mosquitoes, then they're better able to survive?
Yeah, good question. So it's a fairly complex interaction. It's not straight between temperature and increased abundance, because it also relates to precipitation, and that there's also kind of multi-year cycles. So it's not. So it's fairly complex. There are a number of factors that are influencing mosquito abundance, but climate is certainly one of them. And it seems quite clear in Connecticut and in other places that is an important factor in addressing why we're seeing more of these mosquitoes and other kinds of vectors increasing.
And Eastern equine encephalitis is pretty serious, right?
Yes.
Compared to West Nile.
Sorry?
Even compared to West Nile?
Yes. I don't have the numbers in front of me. It's in the report, but it's unfortunately, the mortality rate is quite high. So there was a spike in, was it 2018, 2019, in the last couple of years, and I believe three people in Connecticut died. It was quite shocking. It was quite shocking, especially in the southeastern part of the state where it was taking place. Okay. Tick-borne illnesses. So here you'll see this is actually a decreasing trend, which is one that, we don't have that many of these in the report. But it's that the total and probable cases of Lyme disease in Connecticut have decreased. We have the data here from 2008 to 2018. So that's good news. And it, this is Lyme disease cases, it's not ticks. So it may be that Connecticut residents we are well aware of ticks and Lyme disease, and we have better protective practices to address it, which is good. We've adapted. So that's really good. But the concern that we highlight in the report is that there are other emerging ticks and tick-borne illnesses in Connecticut that are of concern. And the one that we highlight is Lone Star ticks. And so these are they're the most common human biting tick in the southeastern US, and are expanding into Connecticut, likely due to factors including climate change, the warmer temperatures, especially warmer winters that I mentioned before. So the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, they found established breeding populations in Fairfield County in 2018 and New Haven County in 2019. So that means that they are established here. They're not just kind of transient, picked up on someone and traveled over. They're established in the state. And they transmit a number of diseases, including those listed here. I think the popular one that people hear about is the red meat allergy, but they transmit a number of other diseases as well. So that's one to make sure that we stay vigilant, and thankfully we have good scientists that are tracking it here in the state as well. Okay. Another indicator that we looked at was foodborne Vibrio infections. So Vibrio is a bacteria that lives in warm, brackish water. And you can be infected with Vibrio in two ways. One is if you have an open wound and you walk through water that's contaminated with Vibrio, that's one way. Another is if you eat contaminated shellfish that's raw or undercooked. So like the oysters that we like to eat in the summertime, that is a common way to be infected with Vibrio. And that's in fact what we were looking at here, is just the foodborne infections. And you can see that there's a really striking increasing trend of foodborne infections in Connecticut. And that maps onto, on the right-hand side, you can see water temperature in Niantic Bay, so ocean temperature over that same period. And so as water is warming, there's an increasing, we're also seeing this increasing trend in Vibrio infections. Vibrio infections, generate the ones that we see in Connecticut now, that the species that are most common here, they cause like abdominal cramps and digestive issues. Thankfully, they're not as serious as some of the forms that you see in other parts of the country. Okay, so what to do? In terms of policies and programs, we need to continue to be watching for these vectors, mosquitoes and ticks, and their diseases, to be tracking how this is changing in Connecticut, and be prepared for emerging vectors like the Lone Star ticks that I mentioned. Continue with public education, but particularly around these emerging vectors and diseases, and continuing to teach about best practices. And then we can provide better guidelines for our schools, outdoor recreation centers, and homes about what to do to prevent and manage these kinds of infectious diseases. In terms of personal action, you can create a tick-safe zone in your yard. And I mentioned at the bottom that there's a helpful handout that you can get online from the Connecticut Agricultural Station about how to do that. You can, I mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir to be telling people what to do to prevent tick bites. So just continue to do your best practices about staying on trails and wearing long pants and doing a tick check, using appropriate insect repellent. And then keep mosquitoes out of your housing using mosquito tick screens on doors and windows.
And of course, like, make sure there's not places where water's pooling, right?
Yeah, yep. Okay, so our last section is on air quality. I don't have to tell you probably that Connecticut has, and I think maybe especially the southwest of the state, has an ozone problem. We have the American Lung Association gave every county in our state an F grade in at least the last couple, probably all of their national reports, and we make it on lists of some of the areas, particularly in the East Coast, with the worst ozone problems. At the same time, it has gotten better. So you can see that there are these decreasing trends. We're having fewer of these ozone alert days, and the worst kinds of ozone alert days, we're having fewer of them over time. So that's good news. But we have more to go to protect our health. And this is where I'll make the important pitch that addressing climate change, doing climate change mitigation, reducing our greenhouse gases, is also addressing this local air pollution problem, because they're driven by the same source. Ozone is produced from driving our gas-powered cars, from burning fossil fuels in our power plants. Both of those produce both greenhouse gas emissions and both ozone precursors and particulate matter that's also super dangerous to our health. So we can get like a double bang for our buck by transitioning to clean sources.
Yeah, and I noticed that in other parts of the state, the ozone levels have dropped more dramatically than they have certainly in the closest town to us, which is Fairfield, where it's relatively high compared to.
Yeah, and I should say this is it. You can't tell because it's both names, but these are counties. So this is for Fairfield County. So this covers Greenwich. And I think one of the main reasons for this is that actually a lot of our ozone is coming from west of us. It's coming from upwind states, and then it's blowing across the sound, and then influencing our air quality. So it means that we have to essentially work double to reduce the air pollution here because we're receiving this bad air from the west of us.
That was one of the questions who wanted to know if if that's related to our emission, like our carbon emissions as well. But I think, you know, is it the worst parts of our local Connecticut emissions where are they coming from? Are they coming from users and traffic within our state, or is it blown in and transported from, like the ozone is? I mean, I think that I think we have large emissions along the 95 corridor because of trucks and cars.
Yeah, so it's both. It's both that we are producing the pollution here with our own vehicles and our own heating systems and our own power plants, and then it's also coming from states to the west of us.
Forecast for that to be the same for a while or to change?
Well, to some extent, it depends on what we do to reduce our air pollution, and then also what other states do. So thankfully for us, I think New York has taken one of the strongest actions on climate of any state, and so that benefits us, right? If they get to the net zero by, I don't know what it is, 2040, 2050 that they've committed to, that will really improve our air quality. But we also, I think it also, of course, depends a lot on what we do.
Sure.
So I think we often know about ozone, but just to remind us why this matters for our health. So ground level ozone is a strong lung irritant. It can aggravate lung diseases like asthma and emphysema and chronic bronchitis. It's been found to contribute toward the initial development of asthma in children. Of course, we need to remember that asthma is the leading cause for school absenteeism. So you can see how this kind of environmental condition can have a really strong impact on the overall well-being for children. And as I said before, there's this strong relationship between high heat days and ozone alert days, kind of doubling the health risk from this impact. And then maybe one other point about what happens in the future, there's something called the climate penalty with ozone, which is that because ozone is produced in the context of in a reaction induced by warmer temperature and sunlight, that means that as it gets warmer, we're going to have more of those reactions. And so we actually see more ozone with warming temperatures. And so, so that makes the problem stronger in the future. And so we need to take, even stronger action to clamp it down.
Yeah, there's so many, when it comes to climate, there's so many of these cycles that are self-perpetuating, self-exacerbating. The more hot days, the more ozone. And it's similar with the water cycle, right? The more permafrost that melts, the warmer things are. And then the more permafrost and the more carbon gets released into the atmosphere, making it warmer, melting even more permafrost. So there's a lot of those cycles where things are related and they get worse. As things get worse, they get worse.
Yeah. But then the flip side, to say it again, is this health co-benefit of climate action, that as we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions and that's helping us in the long term, then we get this immediate benefit of improved air quality locally. And so that can really give a justification for someone who's saying, this is a global problem that happens in a long time. It is that's not true. The point that we're making in this report is that it's happening here in Connecticut and now, but the added real justification is this issue of air quality that we can really address through our climate mitigation.
Thank you for putting it that way. It's a better way to look at it.
We need to propel action, and so it takes a healthy mix of true information and some optimistic justification.
Absolutely.
So the last indicator that I'll just discuss briefly is on aeroallergens, and this is using really interesting data that's taken from Waterbury Hospital. And so we looked at these 4 aeroallergens: mold, grass pollen, tree pollen, and weed pollen. And we found actually that there was only a trend that that was showing in this data that since 2007, the percent of measured days with high or very high outdoor mold concentrations increased. But there are national studies that are showing a relationship between warmer days and increases in pollen production, and also of the lengthening of the pollen season. And that's certainly something that we expect to see more of under climate change. And allergies can range from kind of annoying to triggering asthma attacks and being quite dangerous to our health. Okay, what to do? We can commit as a state to a goal of 100% zero carbon energy supply by 2040. That's something that's already really in discussion and I think is likely to happen for our state. But the key part here is also generation. So even if we use only clean energy within Connecticut, we still have fossil fuel generated power plants that are kind of selling their energy to other states, but leaving their local pollution here. And that's the case in Connecticut. We're a net exporter of electricity. And so that's a real concern, especially from this public health lens. We need to continue and really ramp up electrifying our transportation and heating sectors. So it's easier to transition our electricity with large offshore wind or other kinds of sources, but switching our cars and our heating, it's more of a challenge. But we've made a really important progress in terms of technology, and so we need to continue to do that. I think one of the places where it's really important and exciting from a public health perspective is electric school buses. And I know there's a lot of excitement around that in Connecticut, and I really encourage you as a town to pursue electric school buses, electric city buses. So that's also where you get a real health benefit, because they're traditionally run with diesel, which has diesel exhaust is very dangerous to your health. Improve active transportation options so that people can get out of their cars and walk with health benefits and climate benefits. And then support strong federal action to limit interstate pollution so that we're getting less of it from our neighbors because they're cleaning up their pollution as well. For personal action, I think I mentioned this before, but you can sign up for an energy audit and make sure that your house is weatherized so that you are most efficient in your heating and cooling. You can opt into renewable electricity, utilize active transportation like walking, biking, and public transit, and electrify with heat pumps and electric vehicles. Okay, I'm just doing a time check. All right, I'm gonna list all of these and then discuss them briefly. So in addition to those specific recommendations, we make overarching recommendations that are trying to get a little bit more at a systems level. And so above all, our report calls for swift action to reduce and eliminate carbon emissions so that we limit the kinds of trends that we're seeing here and that we play our part as a state. Then we need to continue to monitor these conditions so that we can better plan for what's to come and how things are changing. We need to invest in the social determinants of health. So I talked before about the importance of housing, the importance of transportation, these are all factors that affect our health and our climate, and where we can get a real double bang for our buck. We need to tackle the upstream drivers of both climate change and health disparities. I said at the beginning that there are inequitable systems that are driving how climate change has such disparate outcomes, and that there are ways to address issues like structural racism that will address both climate and health disparities. We can pursue actions that integrate mitigation, adaptation, and immediate health benefits. A great example is around urban forestry that does all three. So what are ways that we can do this kind of multi-solving to address these problems at once? We need to build the capacity of health professionals and decision makers. I hope that maybe this presentation does a little bit of that, but many people who are in local decision-making roles don't have background in climate change, and certainly not in climate change and health. We have health professionals, nurses and doctors and EMT folks who don't have background in climate change and don't have the training to know how these kinds of health conditions are changing. And it's really important to address that. And then we need to incorporate climate change into our decisions across all sectors, because certainly it's not just an energy problem, it's a transportation problem, it's a housing problem, all of these, and we need to address them all at once. And then similarly, incorporate public health into our climate change decision-making. I think in the past, it's been seen purely as an environmental problem, maybe as an infrastructure problem, not as a health problem. And we know that that's not true. But there aren't really the resources and the capacity for our public health infrastructure to also address this, and that will be really important as we go forward.
Yes, and you mentioned that the governor's climate change policymaking body, whichever, I'm not sure exactly which body, now has the Department of Public Health at the table. So that's great.
Yeah, it is. So it's really great. It's the Governor's Council on Climate Change. Department of Public Health is a member. But if you look at our local public health offices, they have, as we learned in COVID, have lost investment, and so have very little capacity to then also be addressing climate change. And so that's one place where you see the need for training and resources at that local level as well. So that's it. Again, I encourage you to download the report. You can also see our heat policy brief there, and then we're publishing one soon on air quality. So check that out, and if you join our newsletter, you'll hear all about it. And feel free to follow up with me if you have any specific questions that we don't address in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. I have to say that personally, I'm just so grateful to the Climate Health Center and you for doing this report, because it really does bring this to, it sort of makes explicit what I think a lot of us experience on a day-to-day basis, but we don't really necessarily connect it to these larger patterns of climate change. Maybe Hurricane Sandy was an exception. Some of our odder weather events have been exceptions, but we don't notice that really we're uncomfortable in the summer, maybe because the temperature really is significantly hotter than it used to be. And so that's really, I think it's really important to point out that there are actual health effects on people of all ages. And right here. And some of this stuff scares me. I wasn't really ever focused too much on, I knew West Nile was around, but I wasn't really that focused on some of the scarier things. And I wonder, I just have a quick question, because I know that a lot of this research was being done in 2020. I wonder, is there a connection between things like the pandemic and climate change being more likely I've heard that pandemics are more likely, and I don't, and that they are connected to climate change. I'm not sure that I understand the connection.
Yeah, I know a lot. There's been a lot of discussion about that, or a lot of questions about that, and I haven't. I'll say I haven't seen research that makes the connection, or I haven't really tracked it, but I think the connection that I think is important is one that I kind of mentioned in the beginning, which is that this gives us a sense of what a really significant impact to our society looks like, and how it ripples out into so many different facets, and it shows us the areas where we're prepared and where we're not, and I think that that's a really big warning sign to us, of how we need to be better equipped for something like climate change that will be far more significant than the pandemic, and including in its duration.
Right, or in the course of our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren. In the comment section, somebody has asked, somebody has pointed out that one day that they were communicating with somebody in the Philippines, and they realized that it was warmer here in Connecticut than it was in the Philippines. So I've definitely had that experience where I went to Texas in the summer and it was cooler there. So those are those odd moments that you can have during global warming. Somebody asked if we are tracking, we or anybody is tracking deaths due to climate change. And I guess that maybe she means, have we begun tracking them here in Connecticut?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know if it's been quite tracked in the US as a whole. And because one of the issues is that it's not, there are these direct effects, right? Like heat stroke. But there are a lot where it's that climate change was kind of the thumb on the scale, that it exacerbated existing issues. And so then how do you figure out quite the causality of it? So I don't think that's been done, but there probably has been like some really good modeling that shows, that could show some of those effects. I think it's a great question. I think it would help point to this important connection between health and climate change and changes over time.
Like, I think in the report you referred to it as a risk amplifier, and forgive me if I already said that. But so for people with underlying disease, heart disease, lung disease, or conditions that are related to that, climate change, in the increased temperatures, or maybe susceptibility to infections, can be amplified because of more heat, rising sea levels, brackish water being contaminated with bacteria that maybe otherwise wouldn't thrive. So that was important for me to know. Somebody also mentioned, is asking about net. Does the center have a view about whether electric vehicles are really helpful if we don't change our electric generation supply over to being fossil fuel free? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, good question. So a few points on that. One is that from a health perspective, it's cleaner to have an electric vehicle, even if it's more traditionally powered, because then so that's one perspective, and I think even from kind of a climate perspective, it's more efficient. But in Connecticut, we are something like 60% fossil fuel or carbon-free electricity, and are scheduled to be at 91%, I think, by 2025. So so we're already close to there. Yes, I think that there's certainly both health and climate benefits to making the switch. But the last one is that, like, it's not solving the issue isn't just switching from our existing cars to electric cars. It's also how can we change our transportation systems so that fewer cars are needed, so that we can have more walkable communities, better public transportation that's more accessible and convenient for people, and safer streets for biking. So I think it's not just like a 1-for-1 of switching from the gas powered car to the electric powered car, but trying to solve some of those other problems that we have in transportation.
Right, exactly. And some of us who are here today are really excited that in Greenwich we're really trying to move toward a bike study that will make our streets safer for bikes, and hopefully we'll get that funded and make our town a little bit more bikeable. There's a whole bunch of people working on that, so we're really
that's great. That's great news.
And we have an energy committee that has been newly formed that we're really excited is working on making our town buildings more efficient, energy efficient, therefore more carbon neutral.
Awesome.
So that's going to be those are some exciting things that we're working on, and we've got a long way to go, but I think we're starting to pick up the pace. Somebody asked again about electric vehicles, and can we speak to upcoming legislation that allows EV companies to sell directly to the public? I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm. I'll just be honest, I saw that legislation was introduced, but I didn't track it. It's a very exciting flurry of climate and environmental legislation going through the General Assembly this year, which is great. But I will there's a small number that I kind of followed, and that isn't one of them. But I think finding there are many ways that we need to support this this big shift, and so that's one of them. Building out our charging infrastructure is another one. There are a lot of ways that we need to kind of put in place what makes it viable for electric vehicles in Connecticut.
Right. Somebody says something about, in addition to Vibrio, Nagleri fowleri is found in warm water, both fresh and salt water and pools. I don't know what that is.
I don't either.
maybe our attendee will help. Somebody, and I was thinking about this because I know that we're talking mostly about human health, but human health is related to the health of our agricultural systems. And that's somewhere you didn't go because it's really indirect, but I think about drought and heat and animals health, farm animals not being able to thrive in warmer weather. But somebody asked, how does the soil quality affect climate change and ultimately our health?
I can't give specifics, but there's been a lot of research. I'm not sure if it's on soil quality, but certainly on the kind of vitamin content, the nutritional content of agricultural products and how that is affected by climate change. And I think that my guess is that in a place like Connecticut, that has less of an effect than in other parts of the world where there is deep food insecurity and malnutrition. And so that's a place where it's a real concern and where there's important research being done.
Yes, it's my understanding that as they've measured the protein levels in rice and corn, and they've declined as temperatures have warmed. And, there are entire populations in Asia whose diet relies largely on rice and the protein that is in it, and which is decreasing because of increasing temperatures. And I guess I just understand that, soil quality definitely does affect, whether soil has been laden with pesticides and, single crop cultivated, or, so that it's kind of depleted of nitrogen and all the things that it needs. It doesn't absorb carbon as well as it should if it's, kind of rotationally cultivated and not laden with pesticides, in its sort of more natural state. It absorbs carbon better than the other kind of soil that we've created with mass agriculture.
I'll make just on the kind of how climate change is affecting agriculture here in Connecticut. So I used to work in urban agriculture in Rhode Island and worked with other farmers in Rhode Island, and would talk with them about how climate was affecting them. And it's not just temperature. So it's certainly that it's more erratic of, having these early springs and then a cold snap. That can be really problematic. And then this very hot and dry weather.
Right.
But what they were saying was really that it's this unpredictability, even more unpredictable than the New England weather had been before. And that was really difficult. These heavy downpours and then long stretches of dry and then heavy downpours, that's really hard to deal with for a farmer. And so there were a lot of ways where they were really seeing these kind of small environmental changes affecting their farming practices.
Right, and then the early sort of fall spring that causes the apple blossoms to start to bud, and then then it becomes really cold again. So we didn't really have very many apples last year because we had such a warm winter. I think that there were problems like that with like early fruiting that starts to happen, and then you get another freeze, and then your crop is destroyed for the year.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. And those the ability to grow food that is nutritious in a predictable way, will eventually affect the health of all of us. Not to be grim.
It's another area where we need to make sure to be doing emergency planning too, and it is in our food systems. So both the food that we're producing here, but then the fact that we're getting food from a lot of places all over the world, and with complex supply chains that can be really affected by extreme weather events. And so we have more of a need for doing that kind of planning, understanding how the climate has changed.
Right, exactly. We have one more question. I don't know who somebody's worrying about, somebody's concerned about, what emits more carbon, transportation or utilities versus factories like cement, asphalt. I know that there are statistics on that, and there's, industry, it varies, the amount of cement that take that generation and that takes up carbon emissions is higher in, I think, here in Europe than here. Transportation is a big portion of the carbon emissions, that we generate and electric power generation is another big portion of it. So transportation and power generation are the biggest sectors, as far as I understand it.
It's buildings actually, I think is number 2. Yeah. So don't quote me on this exactly, but I think the number 1 in Connecticut is transportation. And I think the second is residential and commercial buildings. So that's our heating. And then the third is electricity. I think that's right. Or at least buildings are up there toward the top. And that's an area where, again, it's been harder to address it because it's kind of decentralized. We all have our oil tank in our basement, and the solution is installing heat pumps or doing other kinds of ways to electrify heating, which is the challenge that we really need to address.
Right. I mean, I think the good news is that solar has become so much more affordable, and gas, which people seem to think, there's like a big, I think, myth that it's relative, it's less carbon intensive than oil, when actually, the leaks from methane are pretty much offset. The leaks from methane in the natural gas pipelines pretty much offset the benefit to natural gas over oil. But so, there's just existing infrastructure that, it's hard to incentivize people to invest a lot of money in that, and changing their home heating systems, putting solar panels on their roofs. But all of that stuff is getting so much more expensive that it's going to be
less expensive.
Less expensive, I mean.
Less expensive. It's
going to be a much easier choice for people.
That's definitely the case. And there's also incentives through the state and to help pay for these. There's good financing options. And then I think the next step is saying, okay, when do we, and it's soon now, do we say like, we need to, when we're building a new building, we want to set it up to be electrified from the start so we don't have to do these retrofits later. And so how do we start to change our building practices to set us up for this climate-free or this carbon-free future?
Certainly there's a lot of room for improvement there. And I'm really hoping that that people, as people get educated about, the impacts of climate on their health locally and, on their environment locally, that that people will start to make different choices. And also as of course, these renewable energy options become much more financially attractive. But I thank you so much for being with us tonight and for making it really clear, for your work and for the center's work to make clear to Connecticut, the real local on the ground impacts that climate change has on all of us and will have on all of us in the future. And I really hope we can get you back here to talk about this, another time. I have passed your report on, or a summary with highlights and sort of a couple of the recommendations to our first selectman, Fred Camillo, who is very much in support of moving the ball forward, and to other town decision makers. So it's already in the right hands, and
great.
We are definitely incentivized to move here in Greenwich, and we're so thrilled that you're doing this work at Yale. And we'd love to have you back if you will give us more of your time.
I'm happy to be back. I hope we can all be in person sometime soon. I look forward to that. And really glad that the report, you're doing exactly what we hoped with the report, which is learning from it and then sharing it with decision makers to help propel action At the Center on Climate Change and Health, we do this work because we want to see change to address these health and environmental problems, and want to be helpful in that process. So if there are ways that I can help Greenwich in your good actions that you're already underway doing, let me know.
Be careful. Be careful. I'm going to take you up on that. We have a lot of great people here who are really incentivized to, and moved by changing the trajectory of our emissions. But we don't have experts like you in quite the abundance that we like. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks, Allison. Well, and thank you for your great commentary and contributions. It was really fun to be in dialogue with you tonight.
Thank you, everybody, for your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we'll be back. And thank you to Alexandra and the Greenwich Library for organizing this series. I think this is the last of our spring series, but we will be back with more.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
For attending. Be well.